Our thanks to you for joining us for our podcast today on year-end issues. In this, the fourth quarter series, we turn our attention to year-end budgeting.
Hey everyone, welcome to the E2 Effective Elders podcast. E2 is devoted to coaching your elder team to win by providing biblical and practical resources in authentic relationships. E2 wants nothing more than to equip you to move God's kingdom forward in the place you're serving Jesus. Visit us at e2elders.org and please share this good word with others.
Hey friends, thanks for joining us for this, our podcast today at E2 Effective Elders. And as always, we want to thank CDF Capital for their long-term partnership with us, investing in elders across the country and around the world. And a special thanks today to Kevin Hart. Kevin is a good brother in Christ, and not only that, but Kevin and I worked together at Indian Creek Christian Church, the Creek, for a number of years. Kevin is the executive minister over all operations for the Creek in Indianapolis, a CPA by training, and called of God from a secular vocation to a sacred vocation for more than the last 15 years on the staff of churches, and how grateful we are, Kevin. Thanks for being a part of today's conversation.
Well, thanks for having me, Gary. I really appreciate it.
Well, you have much to offer, much indeed. And as I said a moment ago, we are in this series called the fourth quarter. And the fourth quarter, literally, of the year, the last 90 days, for a leader in the church has many different issues and challenges. We've already looked at year-end reviews. We've looked at year-end giving. Well, Kevin is going to help us with year-end budgeting. And 2020 has been quite a year.
That is a very big understatement, Gary. It has been quite a year.
Yeah, well, Kevin, just speak to us about, from your side of the desk in terms of income and expenses. What should elders be thinking about in terms of year-end budget issues?
Yeah, I think the first thing that we really need to look at is giving. There have been a lot of different giving trends in 2020. Some churches have had increased giving. Some churches have had decreased giving. And others have had flat giving. And really, you need to analyze where you are in that spectrum because at budget time, you really have to know what your total income is going to be able to produce an effective budget. So if you're going to have a big decrease, if you've had a 20 or 30% decrease, then that's going to affect how you expense things for the coming year. On the upside, if you've had an increase in giving, the question you have to ask yourself is, will that giving maintain itself through 2021? So there's just some things to think through and actually analyze before we get into the budget particulars on the expense side.
And I know that while we worked together at the Creek, you did a very important analysis for us. And that was called the stratification.
Yes. And I think that's a very helpful way to look at your giving. You can stratify your giving. What we've done at the Creek is from 0 to 500, 500 to 1,000, 1,000 to 2,500, 2,500 to 5,000, 5,000 to 7,500, and so on. And then you look at both the giving amounts and the number of people in those groups. And it really helps you to see where you're gaining and losing donors. And it gives you a lot of information, especially if you do it quarter by quarter, of what's going on in your giving patterns.
So when you say the dollar amount, $0 to $500, are you talking about that's their annual gift?
It is the giving per quarter.
Per quarter.
Yes.
And then you would know how many giving units in that category you had for the last 90 days.
Correct.
Okay. And tell us, when you do that, you crunch the numbers for a quarter and you do the stratification, what are some highlights that elders or staff ought to be looking for in the stratification?
Yeah, one of the things that I look at really closely is where are we gaining or losing donors? So I've noticed in our own giving here at the Creek that we lost a lot of people in the $0 to $500 category. So typically those people aren't as bought in as your regular high-end donors. But still, you want to make sure your front door is still pulling people in. So it's a concern that maybe we need to help them understand about giving and maybe do some education with that group of people. And then if you have what I call your middle belt, if you start losing people in that, that's kind of the backbone of your giving. So you may need to speak to some individuals or groups of people in that range to shore that up. And then again, if you lose large donors, those are individuals that you could have a conversation with. So.
And so when you push print on a stratification report, do you then look back, for example, over a year?
Yes, I usually have 5 to 7 years I look at so I can see a trend in the giving.
Yes.
And then I usually do some averages based on that, the average number of givers you have and the average amount they gave. So it's a lot of information you can glean from very little work if you have a donor system that will allow you to pull that information from. And our database does allow us to do that.
Now, before we talk about the other side of the equation of budgeting, that being the expenses, any word of thought that you would have for elders about year-end giving? Being a CPA and being in ministry for more than 15 years, what would you say about the final quarter of the year?
I would talk to people about it. I would have messages about it. I would have year-end tidbits about giving. There's some things with the CARES Act that have come out recently that would be advantageous for people to know. They can give up to 100% of their adjusted gross income, which is a big deal.
That's a huge deduction.
And then if they can't use it all, that carries forward 5 years. So a lot of people don't know this. This information has just been coming out. So there's a lot of education you can do and help people really understand how they can maximize their giving.
Yeah. Well, what about the flip side of a budget? We've got income, but what about those ever-present expenses? Any thoughts?
Oh, yeah. 2020 has been a very unusual year because of COVID. And I think the first thing I would look at is segregating what COVID expenses you've had and setting those over to the side to evaluate, are they going to be recurring expenses or are they one-time expenses?
Can you give us an example?
Yeah, so like if you bought a backpack sprayer to spray down your areas that you have in your church, you're probably not going to buy another one of those. Or any other machinery like that. But you are going to have the chemicals going forward. So those type of expenses, I would just look at those so you can know, basically have a better educated guess on what you're going to use going forward for 2021. But a lot of the chemicals, the masks, the gloves, I think as long as we're in this until we get a vaccine, you're probably going to spend some money on that. So you're going to have to do that. Some of the other things that you have to really look at are like utility expenses. You may have shut down for a number of months and didn't have utilities running. Well, if you're not shutting down in the year coming up, then you're going to need to increase that utilities expense. And we've also found through shutting down that repairs and maintenance have gone up. For some reason, HVAC equipment runs really well when it runs all the time. When it's shut down, you start to have problems. We replaced a lot of motors and things like that. So you might need to increase your repairs and maintenance budget for items such as that. Some other things that I think it's just always good to look at is where in 2020 were you under budget and where were you over budget? And those under budget areas you really need to look at and analyze to see, is there an opportunity to repurpose that money into other ministry areas that could use the funding? And then sometimes when you're over budget, it's analyzing why were we over budget in an area? Do we need to increase this budget? Was it just a misappropriation of funds, or an estimate, I should say, of doing your budget for the prior year? But going forward, it may be that you need to increase that area. So there's a lot of expenses like that you could look at and really glean some information from.
Yeah, in an obvious area, not only at the creek, but in most churches, is that area of technology.
Correct.
So COVID has pushed church after church into the digital realm. And some far more aggressively than others. But that would be one of your budget items that you would probably refer to.
Sure. One of the other things that, since you mentioned technology, is a lot of computers and assets are bought through expense accounts. And I would go through some of those expense accounts, and you may need to capitalize some items in that area. I know a lot of churches had to do a lot of technology purchases to do online services. So you may want to look at some of your technology-related accounts and see if there's assets in there you need to pull out of expense and actually put into your balance sheet instead of the income statement.
As an asset.
Yes.
Got it. Anything else on expenses?
I think that, just doing a really thorough examination of what you've spent and really what you're going to expect for the coming year, because I think one of the things you have to look at is this income expense balance really is a play off of each other. So we at the Creek always have more income than we spend. And we budget that way on purpose. And that would be something I would just tell elders. I would always want to have a cushion just in case something happens, where your estimate for your income is always going to be higher than your expenses. I found out in 15 years of church work, if you have extra money, it's always easier to spend it than it is to try to get it back. And the other thing is, if you're going to have to cut budgets, and you're going to have to, maybe cut some people out of your budget, maybe even missionaries, I would start having those conversations sooner than later. Also, if you're in a financial situation with the bank where you're not going to meet your covenants, I would start those conversations with the bank now and not wait until later on in the year when it's going to be harder for you to navigate that.
So when you're forecasting perhaps the next 90 days, the first quarter of 2021, and if it appears your income is not going to be able to keep pace with expenses, then you would be coming up with some kind of an action plan. I know that here at the Creek we had that called defcon plan. You want to talk about that a little bit? What's defcon?
Yeah, we have a strategy based upon different income elements of decrease. I think there's a 5% increase, a 10% increase, a 20% increase, and then disaster.
But what do you mean, an increase of what?
A decrease in income, and then you have to decrease expenses to meet that decrease in income.
So then when you use the word increase, you're talking about you have an increasing problem. You have an increasing shortfall.
Yes.
Okay, got it. All right.
And there's different strategies you have to deploy based upon what the situation is. Most people find themselves in the situation, and I would say predominantly most churches, their biggest expense is employees,
Payroll,
and benefits.
Yeah.
And if you're going to cut significant amounts out of your budget, you're going to have to look to that area to do it. It's just impossible to cut enough money out of ministry or operations, because you have fixed income or fixed expenses that you have all the time that you can't cut out. So you really have to then evaluate, your people, and you may have to make some adjustments, not maybe in headcount, but maybe in just reducing salaries overall. And those levels of going up from, like a 5% where we just need to be aware to like over a 25%, that's when you still have to make headcount adjustments and salary reductions.
So if we have a 5% reduction in income, we need to be aware of that, be cognizant. If we have a 25% decrease in income, that's where it may be that we're having some of these painful decisions that need to be made.
Yeah, and I think planning for that right now, I mean, if you're in a situation where you have really decreased income, then I would plan on really starting those conversations now.
Right.
And not waiting until you get, a quarter into the year to try to navigate that.
Correct. We wouldn't want a staff member or a missionary to suddenly find out on a Monday morning or at the beginning of a month that somebody's not getting a support check or somebody's not going to get another week of employment.
Yes, that was bad news is best delivered as early as you can.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we have that DEFCON stratification at E2. If you want to email Gary at e2elders.org, I can share that document with you that Kevin is referring to, the DEFCON response in the event of a financial
And I think it's
hardship.
very important for elders to develop that plan and to work with the staff on, if we have these situations, how are we going to respond to it? You may not need to do that today.
Right.
But at some point, you need to have that plan on the shelf when it happens, that you can pull it off and go, okay, this is what we're going to do. And then it's more of an execution of a plan instead of working through panic.
Right. Yeah.
People don't do well in panic, and having a process really helps.
Yeah. Any other thoughts about year-end budgeting?
I think really we've covered about everything that I wanted to look at. I think, again, with 2020 being a very unusual year, I think it was very difficult for us to prepare a budget. And some advice I might give you is you might look at preparing, not in detail, but in a summary form, maybe 3 budgets. Maybe a best case scenario, an average scenario, and a worst case scenario.
That's good.
And look at where do you think you are in the spectrum of all that, and then talk about it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not fixed science budgeting. It's an estimate, and it's a good estimate. It's an educated estimate, but it's still an estimate. But looking and seeing, can we achieve this? Is this really financially feasible for where we are in our situation? And I think that's really one of the most helpful things you do. I actually did that this year. We are in a fiscal year instead of a calendar year, but I actually prepared 3 budgets and talked to the elders about it before we finalized the budget, and we picked a direction that we thought we would do, and that's exactly what we're doing right now.
Great. Well, and I really appreciate your phrase, talk about it. So as elders, if we follow this good advice and we come up with not 1 but 3 potential budgets, remember a budget is a roadmap. It's not set in stone. It's not erected in concrete. What we need to understand is a budget is a roadmap. And sometimes if we're following the GPS on our phone, we might have to take a detour because a bridge is out. Similarly, hopefully not another 2020 is going to happen in this next year, but we might have to take a detour, and one of those other budgets of the three may have to be our fiscal roadmap. And that phrase, talk about it, as elders, talk about it with one another, talk about it with the staff. I think the staff needs to be welcome to the table. Let's put all of our feet under the table. Let's be open and candid with one another so that nobody is left behind in the dark, and talk about it with the congregation.
Oh, absolutely. I found out in my time in doing what I do, which has been in operations in both the churches I've been in, that the more you can be fiscally transparent, it pays big dividends.
Yeah.
People learn to trust that. And, especially how you present bad news.
Yeah.
And telling people the truth is always the best course. I know a lot of people don't like to do that. They like to maybe shade it or make it look better than it is, and that always backfires.
Yeah.
So, it's painful medicine sometimes to do it, but it's always in the long run, I think, pays a lot of dividends.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Kevin, thank you for some nuggets of truth and some great words of encouragement and challenge. And I'm confident that elders, as well as ministerial staff, if you are joining us on the podcast and you're on a staff team of a church, what Kevin has just said about the fourth quarter year-end budgeting, these are items that we want to have on the front burner of the stovetop. To that end, have a great holiday coming up this week with Thanksgiving. Enjoy the holiday, giving thanks for all that God does indeed provide for us. Thanks for joining us at E2 Effective Elders.